We welcome to the program now Jeremy Nelson, partner at Element Wealth. Jerry, good to see you. Jeremy, pardon me, and Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and all that kind of stuff. We got a new year upon us on the horizon.
Yeah.
What is your crystal ball saying about economic conditions and the markets in general?
Well, so as we went into this year, one of our messages at our economic forecast was, don't be too bearish, right? Just because it was a down year, don't be selling. Our message going into next year is, don't chase the euphoria of the past couple of months.
Okay.
We are going into a presidential election year, right? So presidential election years typically will have a little bit more volatility to them. Now, a lot of people believe that presidential election years tend to be negative for the markets. That is not true. They tend to be average, but they tend to be a little bit above average with in terms of volatility, right? So I think you're going to have a little bit more volatility next year. You've also got some, pretty excessive sentiment in the market right now that's built up over the past couple of months, and that could let off at some point in the first couple months of the year where you could get a little bit of a correction. So, we're kind of telling people, look, the probability of a soft landing, it's gone up. I still tend to think that there's a little bit of economic risk here.
Okay.
There's some tail risk with the rising interest rates and the unwinding of all the Fed stimulus. But thus far, everyone's been wrong, right? We haven't had a recession from it. So the probability of a soft landing is going up, which ultimately would be good for markets next year.
Okay. Well, we've had a great run in November, and it's sort of continued into December.
Yep.
We're trending upward and certainly faring much better, I think, than we thought we were going to be a couple short months ago.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you remember back in October, right, we got down to 4,100 on the S&P. Mm-hmm. And it was like, okay, are we going to retest the lows? That's what all the pundits were talking about. And then, boom, huge rally here at the end of the year. Again, the markets will be a little bit schizophrenic every once in a while, right? And so they'll tend to get overly optimistic and overly pessimistic. Right now, the levels of sentiment that we're seeing, are very, very optimistic. That, as a contrarian, is a little bit of a sell signal in the short run.
Do you think that that's mostly driven by the last Fed meeting where Powell pretty much signaled, we're going to start cutting rates? I mean, at least some people read that into it.
Yeah, I mean, what you've seen, so it's twofold, right? So number one, the market looks and says, okay, the Fed's going to cut next year, so that's bullish. Mm-hmm. In reality, the trouble typically doesn't start until the Fed has to start cutting.
Right.
So,
that's right.
So historically, that's not necessarily the best thing in the world. But what's also happened is that the 10-year Treasury has backed off tremendously, right?
Yep.
We've crossed that 5% line. We've fallen below 4% now. Mm-hmm. So if you start thinking about valuations and discounted cash flows and how you're valuing companies, those lower interest rates are pushing valuations up. So I do think a lot of it has to do with just the 10-year backing off, adjusting valuations upwards. But that was all triggered when the Fed said, okay, yeah, we're pretty much done. Now, the market is forecasting like 6 cuts next year. I don't think we're going to see 6 cuts. If we see 6 cuts, it is going to be because there's problems.
Yeah, and let's explain that. So if the Fed is cutting at that sort of pace, that means they're trying to stimulate the economy because the economy has retracted
exactly
somewhat.
Yeah,
right?
What would happen is if the Fed says, hey, we're going to hold here or we're going to cut 50 basis points throughout the year because we don't need to be this aggressive, inflation is coming down, that's very bullish. But if the Fed had to go 6 times and cut rapidly, they only do that when there's trouble.
Yeah.
And that would mean that there was an economic problem that was brewing
usually.
or recession that was brewing for them to have to cut that much.
Yeah. And I think what's been odd about just the economic performance in general is that unemployment has been remarkably steady and still relatively low.
Yes, but okay. So, what is unemployment? If I'm an Uber driver or door dashing or whatever it might be, then I'm not looking for a full-time job. I am enjoying the gig economy. Then I don't show up as unemployed. So there's a difference between the unemployment rate and the underemployment rate.
Yeah.
But the labor market does continue to be strong. We saw, the auto unions and different groups earlier in the year that were able to leverage the strength in the labor markets for, better pay and better benefits.
And I agree that, and there's been a lot of criticism and even calls for just altering the methodology used in calculating unemployment. And there are multiple calculations, as you know as well, kind of like there is for inflation. But I guess you're not seeing headlines of mass layoffs. That's typically what you experience in a significant downturn. Yeah,
we saw the mass layoffs in 2021 and 2022, late 21 and 22 in tech and banking. Right?
Yeah.
But it hasn't gone through into the industrials and construction and all of those things. Now, a lot of that is because of the government money that is still out there, right? We're still, like in Mississippi, we got 40% or so left of all the infrastructure money to continue to spend.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of what's propping things up a little bit.
I agree. And that's a good point. Of course, on the other hand, that's typically inflationary. So we have the downside of that.
Well, hence, why we haven't broken through 3%
on the inflation front.
So, and this is the thing to remember: inflation compounds, right? It's just because the inflation rate is coming down, it means there's still inflation.
Yeah.
So if you're the average consumer, right? If you're making $50,000 a year, it's not getting easier, right? It's still getting harder. It's just the rate of change is less.
Yeah, and what you got to hope as a consumer is that your wages are at least keeping up with, or if you're in a better position, exceeding the so-called real wages.
Yeah, and then that's where we also get into kind of there's the headline inflation rate, and then there's the real inflation rate that people feel. Right. So if you think about cars. If there are new features, right, self-driving features that are added to the cars, well, those are new features. That's not inflation, but you can't buy a car without them.
Yeah.
Right. Every car has got all of this technology in it now, so things do get more expensive.
Yeah, makes sense. But and in the labor force participation rate, still trailing a bit behind where it was pre-COVID.
Yeah,
we're not there yet.
Yeah, what you're saying is that there are people who are just saying, you know what, hey, we're not going to go back to work.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to be a single income household, which nowadays is very difficult.
Yeah. Something else I think that's at play there with respect to government policy is the employee retention credit, which you're just seeing a whole industry spring up, just consulting with companies to file for and get their money. And it's turning out to be rife with fraud as well.
Oh, look, this one right here, buyer beware.
Yeah.
On that one, and that's a lot of money. Look, so I've got business owner clients who were legitimately affected by COVID. They got the PPP funds. They made it through. Their business is stronger today, but then they were still eligible for the ERC, the Employee Retention Tax Credit. Well, that's kind of a pretty big government handout to a lot of people. And, that money is out there. So I do think that is part of the stimulus and what is keeping consumption up as well.
I definitely do as well. And we should point out that goes back to 2020. I mean, this is
that was President Trump signed that on his way out.
Yeah, sure did. So, but like I said, it has given rise to an entire industry of consultants, accountants, and the like, or just firms dedicated to just helping people file these credits, I assume they get compensated to some degree on that. Probably
They typically get about 20% of what you get.
There you go.
Yep.
So, and you can still do it, even though it was enacted in 2020. We got Jeremy Nelson, partner at Element Wealth, in the Element Wealth studio. More to discuss after this. Is that the IRS has adjusted the tax brackets for the next year.
Yes.
Which is, of course, their policy based on inflation. Mm-hmm. And so we have experienced some inflation. And there's an adjustment to the standard deduction. Remember, under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we eliminated the personal exemptions, but we doubled, frankly, the standard deduction. And so that's going up, I think, a couple of grand or something like that.
That's going to go up, roughly 3% from what it was.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. And then also the brackets have been restructured to account for inflation as well.
So every year, and so this is really, really important to understand, because if you start getting into your Medicare premiums and all that kind of stuff, how much income you can have before you get hit with those. If you're looking at doing Roth conversions, filling up some of those lower tax brackets, in those early years in retirement before you get to required minimum distributions, you need to know where these levels are, because they change every year. And with the inflation over the past 3 years now, they've shifted dramatically.
Yeah.
Also, what you'll see is that the amount of money that you pay Social Security tax on if you're working has gone up dramatically.
Up as well.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So it just depends on where you fall in the income spectrum. Mm-hmm. But in general, a lot of people will see their taxes actually go down. If their income remains relatively level or increases somewhat, they'll actually see a benefit there because of standard deduction. I just looked it up. It's going from $27,700 for married couples filing jointly to $29,200.
Yeah. So it's a pretty good.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good jump.
So essentially, that just means that additional money there, that $2,000 is a little less than $2,000 is deducted from your income, additional deduction, if you will, before you arrive at the value that you used to apply the tax to. So,
if you're doing, year-end tax planning and all those sorts of things, where you're planning for next year, especially if you're in retirement, this is something that you really want to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Sometimes what we'll see our clients do is we'll do like 2 years of charitable giving, because once you get into retirement, a lot of times you can't itemize, right?
That's right.
And so what a lot of our clients will do is they'll kind of they'll do all their charitable giving for 2 years at once in a tax year, and then that way they can recapture the standard deduction.
Yeah, makes sense. So, but on the horizon, something we've talked about frequently on the program is the expiration of the individual provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So those stay in place through 2025. Right. Yeah. Effective 2026. Unless the Congress acts, I suspect they will. They typically do when something like that, when major tax policy expires.
But here's the question, right? So that's letting those expire is the path of least resistance to address a $2 trillion deficit.
True.
Right.
True.
So if you're of the belief, right, which I am, that you have to do something about a $2 trillion deficit, that this is not sustainable, right? That it will ultimately lead to a bigger problem, then something has to be done. Now, look, you got to find ways to cut spending. To me, that's the first place you go, right?
Sure.
Cut spending. But something has to ultimately be done, and as you talk about on the show all the time, a lot of the money is going to non-discretionary programs.
70%.
Yeah. So there's not a ton of room to go and find that $2 trillion, right, to push towards a balanced budget.
Right.
So if that's the case, then there has to be a revenue increase to get this under control. And so there are very, very difficult things, decisions that are going to have to be made at the federal level to address this. And I really think that is going to be a massive topic as we go into the midterms after this next presidential election.
That's absolutely right. The midterms would be coming up in 26. So you got to feel like, though, once they all are seated in January of 25, a whole new House potentially, and then, of course, lots of movement in the Senate as well, potentially a new president, that the year 2025, that first year of the new class, they're going to have to take this up, given that it expires at the end of 2025.
They're going to have to. There's going to be pressure. So a little thing that no one's talking about, this is the first year in many, many years where the dollar index is down.
Yeah.
Right. So, if the dollar index were to continue to decline, right, and there was less demand for dollars throughout the globe, that's going to put more pressure on us. That's something that is coming. And at our economic forecast events that are coming up in January, this is one of the things that we're going to be talking about, actually, is that, we think that the rubber is going to meet the road here at some point in the next few years on these deficits look, we've just accumulated too much debt. It's out of control. It's got to be addressed at some point in time. And that's not a doomsday prophecy, right? I saw the Harry Dent interview on Fox. I've had clients send it to me, right? Yeah. Look, go YouTube Harry Dent. He says this every year. I mean, it's consistent. He's saying the same thing all the time. But my point is that some of the points that he makes are legitimate points. Now, the impact that it will have on the economy and markets, we don't know. That's yet to be seen. But these are major issues that are going to have to be addressed. And I do hope that as we get into the election cycle here, that this is one of the topics that comes up, right? How are we going to address this? Because, it's time for some fiscal restraint at the federal level.
Yeah, and they talk about it at a very high and almost ambiguous and very just generic level.
Yeah.
Hey, we got to cut spending. Okay, what?
And then they don't do anything.
They don't do anything.
And we've talked about this, off the air and on the air before.
Yeah.
And clients always come to me and say, "Well, when is the debt going to matter?"
Yeah.
And I said, or they say, "Why doesn't the debt matter?" I say, it doesn't matter until it matters, right?
Yeah.
And when it matters, it really matters. Yeah. And that's what we're pushing towards with this federal debt right now.
But just nobody will offer specifics. You'll hear that refrain a lot. We've got to rein in the radical spending. Yeah, I agree. I mean, and across the board you'll hear that, certainly from the right. But nobody offers any specifics.
Well, what are you going to do? What are you going to cut?
Right.
I mean, are you really going to go and pull money from the military with everything that's going on in the world right now?
Yeah.
Are you going to cut someone's Social Security? I don't think so, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to cut Medicare? I don't think so, right?
Right.
So, I mean, sacrifices will have to be made.
Yeah, so you just wonder, are we poised to perhaps see a combination of cuts and perhaps adjustments to the tax code to increase revenue?
Yeah,
attempt to increase revenue.
And I mean, if you go and let's kind of think about the implications that this could have down the road. This could trigger what we call like a secular bear market. Now that doesn't mean like, oh no, it's the Depression.
Yeah.
Like that. Let's put that off the table. That's not what we're worried about. But, if you say stocks average 10% over time, well, from 2009 to 2021, they averaged 15%.
Yep.
From 82 to 2000, they averaged 18. Well, that means that there's other long-term periods where market returns are much, much lower.
Yeah.
This could trigger one of those periods of time.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. I just remain frustrated that even those who hold themselves up as really strong fiscal conservatives don't offer a lot of details in terms of plans to truly cut spending. And I don't mean by a little, because the problem is not a little, it's big.
It's massive.
And a lot of people say, well, you got to start somewhere. Okay, but where do you end? I mean, you need to see a plan that says, here's how we get to a point where we're not generating $2 trillion deficits on an annual basis.
Yeah, look, and essentially what's been happening is we've been kicking the can down the road to the Gen Xers, the millennials, now the Gen Zs.
Yep.
This is a big issue that needs to be addressed.
Got to be serious about it. And, of course, those running for office are always careful not to say anything that would impose pain on either side, taxes or reining in spending, because they fear that it won't sell very well to the voter for election day.
How do you get elected when you're saying, hey, we're going to raise your taxes or we're going to reduce your benefits?
Only from generally folks on the left that say, well, that's okay if you go tax the rich people. They're all, and they think that can literally power the entire nation, just confiscate more from a small sliver of society.
But again, if you pull all of it from the rich people, you lose investment,
No doubt.
which then ultimately impacts jobs for everybody.
Yeah.
Yep.
Jeremy, appreciate you coming in. Have a happy New Year, sir. I'm sure we'll be talking to you soon. Thanks
Looking
a lot.
forward to it. Happy New Year.
Jeremy Nelson, partner at Element Wealth, coming right back.